Picture this. It's 40,000 years ago, the temperature has dropped so far below freezing that your eyelashes are turning into tiny icicles. And the only shelter for miles is a dead woolly rhino. Not a cave, not a hut. A carcass, and somehow, against every instinct screaming at you to run in the opposite direction, you're crawling inside it. This wasn't some horror movie scene dreamed up by a screenwriter with a grudge against animals. This actually happened. Repeatedly. Across continents. Across tens of thousands of years. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why sleeping inside a dead animal wasn't just survival, it was genius. Let's set the stage properly, because context matters here. We're talking about the Ice Age, specifically the brutal stretches of the Pleistocene when much of Europe, Asia, and North America looked less like the world you know and more like a frozen wasteland, punctuated by the occasional herd of enormous, shaggy megafauna. Temperatures regularly plunged to levels that would make a modern winter coat look like a cruel joke. Wind chill wasn't a weather app statistic, it was a daily executioner. And humans, these fragile, hairless, thin-skinned primates who evolved in the warmth of Africa, somehow spread themselves across this icy hellscape anyway. How does a species built for savannas survive an environment that would kill it in under an hour without protection? The answer, it turns out, was walking around on four legs, weighed several tons, and occasionally became very, very useful once it stopped breathing. Mammoths get most of the spotlight in these stories, and for good reason. A fully grown woolly mammoth could weigh up to 6 tons, stand over 3 meters tall, and carry a hide so thick and insulated that it could keep the animal comfortable in temperatures that would flash freeze a human within minutes. When early humans encountered a mammoth carcass, whether through hunting, scavenging, or just fantastic timing after the animal died of natural causes, they weren't looking at rotting meat and thinking, gross. They were looking at the ancient equivalent of a fully furnished insulated cabin, already built, already weatherproofed, and conveniently pre-stocked with food. Waste nothing. That was the rule that kept people alive, and it applied to every single part of that animal, including, when necessary, its own body as a place to sleep. Now here's where it gets specific, and honestly, where it gets a little wild. Archaeological sites across Ukraine, Russia, and parts of Central Europe have turned up something remarkable. Dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth bones. Places like Mazirich in Ukraine reveal circular structures made from skulls, jaws, tusks, and leg bones, stacked and arranged with a level of architectural intention that would put some modern furniture assembly instructions to shame. These weren't accidents. These were engineered shelters using bones as a structural framework and hides stretched over the top as insulation. But before humans got to the point of building elaborate bone lodges, the very first stopgap solution, the emergency shelter version, so to speak, was often cruder and far more direct. Hollow out a portion of a freshly killed or found carcass, clear enough space to fit a human body, and crawl inside before hypothermia finished the job the cold had started. Think about the physics for a second, because this is where the genius really shines through. A dead animal, especially a large one, retains heat for a surprisingly long time after death, particularly in its core, and especially if the outer hide remains intact. That hide, thick with fur and fat, acts as a natural insulating barrier, exactly the same way it did when the animal was alive. Combine leftover residual body heat with a windproof barrier of hide and fat, and you've got yourself a shelter more effective than anything early humans could construct from sticks and branches in a 5-minute emergency. It's the same principle behind why survivalists today are trained, in absolute worst-case scenarios, to use the body cavity of a freshly killed large animal as emergency shelter. Arctic explorers, mountaineers, and survival experts have documented this exact technique for over a century. It's grim. It's not glamorous, but it works, and it worked for our ancestors long before it had a name in any survival manual. There's a reason this technique echoes so persistently through history too, not just prehistory. Inuit and other Arctic peoples have long traditions of using animal skins, not just as shelter coverings, but as literal sleeping enclosures, essentially turning a hide into a sleeping bag, sometimes with the fur still attached, sometimes stitched into elaborate multi-layered bedding systems designed to trap body heat with brutal efficiency. Sealskin, caribou hide, polar bear fur, all of it repurposed not just for warmth, but for survival in temperatures that make a typical winter storm look like a light drizzle. The step from sleep under a hide to sleep inside the carcass itself isn't actually that large a leap. It's a difference of degree, not of concept. When the emergency is severe enough and the hide is still attached to the source, you don't waste time skinning it first. You just get in. Let's talk about a specific and honestly fascinating piece of evidence that keeps coming up in this conversation. Horse and bison carcasses used by early humans in the same emergency shelter capacity. Bison, in particular, played an enormous role in the survival strategies of ancient peoples across the plains. Long before horses were domesticated, and long before any of the infrastructure we associate with organized hunting cultures existed. A freshly killed bison, gutted quickly, provided not just meat and hide, but literally warm, sheltered space inside its own rib cage. Picture a hunting party caught in a sudden blizzard, miles from any camp, with a bison they'd just brought down. Do they trek back through a whiteout and risk frostbite, or do they hollow out the body, climb inside, and wait out the storm surrounded by the animal's own fading warmth? Every account of ancient survival technique, every parallel drawn from more recent indigenous practices, and every basic principle of thermodynamics tells you which option kept people alive. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how counterintuitive this all is to a modern audience, because we live in a world of central heating, synthetic insulation, and heated car seats. The idea of climbing inside a dead animal to survive sounds, on the surface, like the setup to a fear-inducing folktale, or something out of a movie where a character gets a little too creative during a snowstorm. But strip away the modern squeamishness for a second and look at it from a pure engineering perspective. What are you actually looking for in emergency shelter? You want insulation, you want wind protection, you want a barrier between your body and the merciless cold. A dead animal's body, especially one that's freshly killed, checks every single one of those boxes better than almost anything else available in a barren, treeless, freezing landscape. It's not romantic. It's not pretty. But it is, without question, effective. And here's a detail that tends to surprise people. This wasn't limited to desperate one-off emergencies. There's decent evidence to suggest that some groups incorporated this practice into more routine, planned survival strategies, particularly during long hunting expeditions far from established camps. If your hunting party brings down a large animal far from your settlement, and night is falling with a storm rolling in, the smart move isn't to leave the kill and rush home. It's to process what you can, use the carcass itself as your shelter for the night, and finish the job in the morning. This wasn't a rare, panicked act of desperation. In many contexts, it was simply the practical, sensible choice, no different conceptually from a modern camper choosing to pitch a tent near their car instead of hiking back in the dark. Now let's bring Neanderthals into this conversation, because they deserve way more credit than pop culture typically gives them. For decades, Neanderthals were portrayed as brutish, none too bright cousins of Homo sapiens, but modern archaeology has completely dismantled that image. Neanderthals crafted tools with remarkable precision, controlled fire deliberately rather than just opportunistically, made use of complex hide processing techniques, and adapted brilliantly to some of the harshest climates our planet has ever produced. Sites associated with Neanderthal habitation across Ice Age Europe show clear evidence of using large animal remains, bones, hides, and yes, likely carcasses, as structural and insulative elements of their shelters. If any hominid species understood the brutal calculus of survival in freezing conditions, walking the line between "this is disgusting" and "this keeps me alive," it was Neanderthals, who thrived in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years using exactly this kind of resourceful, no-nonsense adaptation. Let's also talk about scale, because the sheer size of some of these animals is almost impossible to wrap your head around from a modern perspective. We've mentioned mammoths and bison, but consider the woolly rhinoceros, an animal built like a tank with a coat thick enough to handle subarctic winters. Or consider giant deer, cave bears, and other now-extinct megafauna that once roamed these frozen landscapes in numbers we can barely fathom today. Every one of these animals represented in death an enormous reservoir of resources: meat for calories, bone for tools and structure, sinew for cordage, fat for fuel and food, and hide, always the hide, for warmth, for shelter, for survival. When you're a small band of humans facing an ice age winter with none of the infrastructure we take for granted, you don't get to be picky about your shelter options. You use what's biggest, warmest, and closest. Sometimes that meant a cave, sometimes that meant a hastily assembled hide tent. And sometimes, when the timing lined up and the emergency was severe enough, that meant the animal itself, freshly killed, still warm, functioning as a shelter in the most literal sense imaginable. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. There's also a psychological dimension to this that's worth exploring, because surviving inside a dead animal isn't purely a physical challenge, it's a mental one too. Our modern brains are wired with a deep, visceral aversion to anything associated with death and decay, and for good reason, that aversion historically kept our ancestors away from disease and contamination. But survival sometimes demands overriding that instinct entirely. Early humans who mastered this technique had to push past a deeply ingrained discomfort, prioritizing the immediate, tangible threat of freezing to death over the abstract unease of proximity to a carcass. That's not a small mental hurdle. That's the kind of pragmatic override that separates species who merely exist in an environment from species who actually conquer it. Every time you hear about ancient humans doing something that sounds shocking or extreme to modern sensibilities, remember that shock is a luxury of comfort. When survival is genuinely on the line, priorities shift fast, and what looks unthinkable in a heated living room looks like common sense in a blizzard with no other shelter for 50 miles. Let's shift gears slightly and talk about the broader context of hide usage in ancient human life. Because sleeping inside a carcass wasn't an isolated freakish behavior, it existed on a spectrum of increasingly sophisticated use of animal remains for warmth and shelter. At the most basic level, you have the emergency carcass shelter we've been discussing, a stopgap, immediate need solution. One step up from that, you have simple draped hides, animal skins thrown over branches or rock formations to create quick windbreaks. Beyond that, you have processed and cured hides sewn together into more permanent tent coverings, the kind associated with structures like teepees and yurts in later human history. And at the most advanced end of that spectrum, you have fully engineered garments, sewn hide clothing with bone needles, multiple layers, and design features specifically adapted to trap body heat while allowing mobility, essentially the Ice Age equivalent of a high-performance winter jacket. Sleeping inside a dead animal sits at the very beginning of that spectrum, the crudest, most immediate version of a survival principle that humans would go on to refine into some genuinely impressive engineering over the following tens of thousands of years. One thing that consistently gets underestimated in these conversations is just how quickly hypothermia can kill a person, and how radically that changes your risk calculus in the moment. In freezing temperatures with high wind, a human without adequate shelter can develop life-threatening hypothermia in under 30 minutes. Confusion, loss of motor coordination, and eventually cardiac issues can follow rapidly after that. This isn't a slow, gentle process, it's a countdown clock, and once it starts ticking, rational, careful decision-making becomes harder and harder as your body temperature drops. Early humans, navigating Ice Age winters, understood this reality on a bone-deep level, quite literally, because the ones who didn't understand it fast enough didn't survive to pass that knowledge on. Every single decision about shelter, including the decision to use a dead animal's body as an emergency refuge, was shaped by that unforgiving, ruthless clock. There was no time for hesitation, no time for squeamishness, and absolutely no time for debating whether it felt appropriate. You assessed the threat, you assessed your options, and you acted. Let's talk a little more about the archaeological evidence itself, because skeptics reasonably ask how we actually know any of this happened, given that a decomposed carcass doesn't exactly leave behind a neat labeled artifact for archaeologists to find. The evidence comes from multiple overlapping sources. First, there's the direct evidence from mammoth bone dwellings, structures that clearly demonstrate humans using large animal remains as architectural material on a significant, planned scale, which strongly implies familiarity with using animal bodies for shelter in less permanent, more improvised ways too. Second, there's ethnographic evidence from more recent hunter-gatherer societies, groups whose practices, observed and documented over the last few centuries, preserve techniques and survival knowledge passed down across countless generations. Techniques that plausibly echo far older Ice Age practices given how similar the environmental pressures were. Third, there's straightforward thermal and survival science, modern research into hypothermia, insulation, and emergency survival techniques that confirms again and again that carcass shelters are a genuinely effective emergency solution, meaning it would be strange, honestly, if resourceful ancient humans facing the same brutal conditions somehow failed to arrive at the same solution independently. Put those three threads together, architectural evidence, ethnographic parallel, and hard survival science, and you get a remarkably consistent picture, even without a single perfectly preserved, human sleeping inside carcass archaeological snapshot. There's also something almost beautifully practical about how this technique reflects the broader relationship ancient humans had with the animals around them. We tend to imagine ancient hunter-gatherer life as some sort of adversarial relationship between humans and megafauna, a constant battle for survival where animals are simply obstacles or resources to be conquered. But the reality is more nuanced and, honestly, more respectful than that framing suggests. Nothing was wasted. Every part of an animal's body served a purpose, extending its usefulness long after its death, sometimes in ways that quite literally kept the humans who depended on it alive through conditions that would otherwise have killed them outright. Using a carcass as shelter wasn't disrespectful or crude. It was the logical extension of a worldview that saw every resource as precious, every opportunity as potentially life-saving, and every part of a hunted or scavenged animal as something too valuable to leave behind. Let's also address something that tends to come up whenever this topic gets discussed: the question of disease and contamination. Wouldn't sleeping inside a decomposing animal expose early humans to serious health risks? And the honest answer is yes, absolutely. There were real risks involved, and this wasn't a technique used casually or for extended periods. This was very specifically an emergency, short-term solution used in the most extreme circumstances, when the immediate threat of freezing to death outweighed the slower, less certain risk of infection or illness. A carcass used for shelter within hours of death, in freezing temperatures that naturally slow bacterial growth to a crawl, presents a very different risk profile than one left for days in warmer conditions. Cold weather is actually a natural preservative, slowing decomposition dramatically, which is precisely why this technique was so viable specifically in Ice Age conditions. The freezing temperatures that made shelter so urgently necessary were the same freezing temperatures that made using a freshly killed carcass for that shelter comparatively safe, at least for the short term required to survive a single brutal night or a passing storm. It's genuinely remarkable, when you step back and look at the full picture, how many of humanity's survival breakthroughs come down to this same basic formula. Look at what's available, understand its properties deeply, and use it in ways that go beyond the obvious surface-level function. A dead animal is, on the surface, just meat and material. But early humans looked deeper than that. They saw a walking, breathing thermal engineering marvel, evolved over millions of years to survive in extreme cold, and they recognized that even after death, much of that engineering remained functional for a crucial window of time. That's not a coincidence or a lucky accident. That's the product of deep, hard-won environmental knowledge, passed down and refined across countless generations of people who depended on exactly this kind of resourcefulness to survive. Consider, too, how this reflects on human adaptability as a species overall. We didn't evolve thick fur. We didn't evolve natural antifreeze in our blood the way some Arctic fish species did. We didn't evolve the ability to hibernate through the worst months of winter. By almost every measure of physical adaptation to cold, humans should have been confined to warm climates permanently, unable to expand into the freezing regions of the ancient world. And yet we didn't stay confined. We spread across nearly every climate on Earth, from equatorial rainforests to the edges of glaciers, And we did it not through biological evolution, but through behavioral and technological innovation, using intelligence and resourcefulness to compensate for what our bodies lacked naturally. Using a dead animal's body as an emergency shelter is a small, visceral, almost uncomfortably intimate example of that broader pattern, but it's an example nonetheless, a tiny window into the incredible ingenuity that let a fundamentally tropical primate conquer an ice age. And honestly, there's something worth sitting with here about how differently we relate to death and animal bodies today compared to our ancestors. Most people alive right now have never seen an animal be killed, let alone processed one for survival. Meat arrives in neat plastic packaging. Warmth arrives through a thermostat. The entire, brutal, immediate calculus of survival that shaped human behavior for hundreds of thousands of years has been almost completely abstracted away from daily modern life, replaced by convenience and infrastructure so seamless that we rarely think about it at all. That's an incredible achievement of civilization, but it also means we've lost touch with just how close to the edge our ancestors constantly lived, and how creative, adaptive, and frankly tough they had to be just to make it through an average winter. Every time a story like this surfaces, whether it's ancient humans using carcasses as shelter or any of the countless other resourceful survival techniques uncovered by archaeology, it's worth remembering that these people weren't primitive in the dismissive sense that word often implies. They were expert problem solvers operating with a level of environmental knowledge that most modern humans, dependent as we are on supply chains and central heating, simply couldn't replicate if our lives depended on it. Let's bring this full circle now, back to that opening image. A person crawling into a freshly killed animal in the middle of an ice age blizzard. From a modern armchair, that image might trigger a flinch, a moment of discomfort, maybe even a joke about how you'd rather just take your chances with frostbite. But hold that image up against everything we've covered. The thermal properties of hide and fat, the residual body heat of a recently killed animal, the brutal, unforgiving speed of hypothermia. The broader tradition of hide-based survival technology stretching from emergency carcass shelters all the way to sophisticated sewn winter clothing, the architectural evidence of mammoth bone dwellings, the ethnographic parallels from Arctic peoples using animal skins as sleeping enclosures, and the simple, undeniable fact that the people who figured this out survived long enough to pass their genes and their knowledge down to us. Suddenly that image doesn't look disgusting or shocking anymore. It looks like exactly what it was, a brilliant, resourceful, split-second survival decision made by people who understood their environment on a level most of us will never come close to matching. So the next time you're bundled up under 3 blankets, complaining about your thermostat being set a couple degrees too low, spare a thought for the people who came before us, who faced temperatures that could kill in half an hour, armed with nothing but stone tools, animal hides, fire when they could get it, and an absolutely relentless will to survive. They looked at the frozen wasteland around them. They looked at the massive, powerful animals sharing that wasteland with them, and when the moment demanded it, they made a choice that sounds unthinkable today, but kept entire lineages of human beings alive through some of the harshest conditions our planet has ever thrown at us. That's not a horror story. That's not a grim footnote in some dusty textbook. That's one of the clearest, rawest examples we have of exactly what makes humans such a remarkably adaptable, endlessly resourceful species, capable of surviving in places our bodies were never designed for, using tools and knowledge and sheer nerve to bridge the gap that evolution left wide open. And honestly, if that doesn't earn our ancient ancestors a little respect, I'm not sure what does.